Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Elizabeth Aaron. I hope you're all faring well, enjoying the summer weather, and have been getting in some good movies. Today, I'm going to look at 4 movies that come from another time period. I find period pieces fascinating, the way they can help you really get a sense of history, between the costumes and the setting, the language. I just love being immersed in another time, and it also helps me appreciate the time I'm now in. Often in these period pieces, the historical circumstances are tough. I hope you'll get an appreciation for this too. Interestingly, all of the movies I'm looking at today have an Academy Award-winning or Academy Award-nominated actor. In the first segment of the show, I'll be talking about the first major feature film directed by Academy Award-winning actor Natalie Portman. Her movie is called A Tale of Love and Darkness. In the second segment, I'm going to look at the Oscar-nominated film Pride and Prejudice with Keira Knightley. In the third segment of the show, I'll be giving you my thoughts on a movie called Alone in Berlin, which is starring Academy Award-winning actor Emma Thompson. And then stick around for the end of the show, when I'll be talking about a period film that is brand new on Netflix called The Ottoman Lieutenant, which is starring Academy Award-winning actor Ben Kingsley. Let's dive on in. As I mentioned, the first movie I'm talking about today is called A Tale of Love and Darkness. It is directed by Natalie Portman, and she also stars in it. This movie came out originally in 2015. It's an hour and 38 minutes long. It's rated PG-13 because there is some thematic content and some disturbing violent images. And this movie is based on a real-life story, as well as a book. It's based on the memoirs of author Amos Oz. And according to Netflix, where I saw this movie, it describes this movie as the poetic drama that shares his family's tale of suffering and survival in the early years of independent Israel. And so, not a surprise, this movie is a biography, a drama, and it's historical. Something to keep in mind is that this movie is all subtitled. While probably most of the movies you've seen Natalie Portman in, she is speaking English, something that you may or may not know about her is that she was born in Israel. Her family had moved to the United States when she was very young, but apparently she is fluent in Hebrew. And also, this is a super ambitious project for Portman. Not only did she direct the movie and star in it, she also wrote the screenplay. That is quite a trifecta. And to direct yourself is very challenging as well. And this movie is beautiful. It is one class act. And in fact, Natalie Portman was nominated for the Golden Camera Award at the Cannes Film Festival in 2015. And in 2016, the Cinema for Peace Awards nominated her for Most Valuable Movie of the Year. And Portman, if you don't know, is the winner of the 2011 Oscar for Best Performance by an Actress in a Leading Role for Black Swan. And she's been in such movies as Cold Mountain, Garden State, V for Vendetta, and Jackie. In terms of directing, though, she's a newcomer. She had directed a short film in 2008. She directed a segment in another movie called New York, I Love You. And then this is her first major feature. And this movie stars Gilad Kahana, and he is pretty new to acting too. He, prior to this, was in the movie called The Man in the Wall, and he was credited with lyrics for episodes of several TV series. It looks like they're Israeli. His character is married to Portman's character, His character is named Arya, and Portman's is Fanya. And the movie also stars Amir Tesler. He plays their son, Amos, who is the namesake of the author Amos Oz. And this is the first movie that Amir Tesler has starred in. And so Natalie Portman chose to have a few new coming actors in this movie, and they did a fabulous job. The first thing that struck me when I started watching this movie was how literary it is. Granted, it is based on a memoir, but there's so much involved in language. There is an older gentleman who plays the main character in old age, who is looking back, and his language is just poetic as he talks about what things look like from the past and what his reflections are. And then we learn that Arya has written some books, so he himself is pretty scholarly. We frequently see him in a library area with lots of books, his pen in hand ready to write something. And then something that makes Amos's life so special is his relationship with his mother, and she is quite the storyteller. She is often using her imagination and telling him different things that happen. She snuggles up with him before bed a lot of the time and reveals these different stories and may ask for his participation in telling it. It's all very intimate and sweet. But she goes beyond that too. She often shares nuggets of wisdom. And she has a closer relationship with him than Amos has with his father, who seems to be a bit standoffish and a little more strict. So this movie is very literary, and if you like words and you like reading, I think you'll probably enjoy this quite a bit. That said, its title of A Tale of Love and Darkness is accurate, so this is not necessarily an uplifting movie, but I would call it a deeply honest movie, an intimate movie, and a movie that shows the inside story of a family's life in Israel back in the 1940s. Now, this story is the story of Amos, and it is told through his eyes. And not just the older man as a narrator telling the story, but throughout we see everything from the point of view of Amos as a child, trying to figure life out, why things happen the way they do. It was a good reminder of how difficult it can be to be a child, because you just don't have the wherewithal and the time on the planet that's long enough in order to have perspective. As a result, though, we get to see how tender and kind his parents ultimately are. The story is broken up into two sections. The first section takes place in 1945, and the second section takes place in 1947. So the first section is really about getting to know the family and seeing what life is like as Amos is growing up. We get introduced to his more distant relatives as well as family friends. The second section of the movie is centered around the fact that Israel has gotten its independence, and this was something that everyone was excited about, and yet the tables turned, and actually that ended up being the beginning of a war. And between these two periods of time, we see a metamorphosis. And I would say, more than anything, although this movie does share the whole story of this family, this is really a story about a mother and a son. And at the very beginning, the narrator talks about how his mother had died when she was 38. Much of this movie is about how he related to his mother, how they bonded, how much she meant to him, and then we get to see how she goes through changes, and how there's a shift in who was taking care of whom, and how that impacted the family. I will say this movie is an hour and 37 minutes. It felt much longer, and it packed in a lot of storytelling. Some of the intimate moments that we see that also show what life is like through Amos's eyes are often he would hide underneath the dining table, and he would look at what was going on around him through the lace tablecloth. So through his eyes, we get to spy on his mother bringing over her sisters and friends and how they're talking about the burden of children. And we take that in as the audience as to how this lands on Amos. We also live vicariously through him as he goes off with other family friends. There's one incident where he's told he must behave and be a good boy. They're a guest at someone's home. And he talks to an Arab girl and tries to impress her by climbing up a tree and playing with a swing that she's on. And I don't want to give away the details, but the result is there is an injury that happens. and this shapes how he sees things going forward. There's also a scene where his father talks to him about bullying and tells a pretty horrific story about how his own father, Amos's grandfather, as an adult had been bullied, and how this pretty much humiliated Amos's father. And Amos's father warns him that bullying is probably going to be happening. It is not very avoidable. And we see moments of this. And eventually we see how Amos is able to handle it in a way that is both surprising and ingenious, and is clearly based on the influence that his parents have on him. Pretty much in this first part of Amos's life, it's pretty happy. He loves his mom. She is very doting on him. Both his parents are very caring about him. But slowly the darkness gets revealed. He starts seeing his mother brooding about old memories. He hears about the bullying. He sees simple things like neighborhood boys throwing mud at clean laundry hanging outside. And they're asking him if he wants to come play. And this will clearly involve being part of this kind of prank. But he says he has to go off because his grandmother is visiting. And then we see him sneak up and be a voyeur about how his mother and grandmother are getting along. And they're having a very disturbing talk. And he gets to witness some shocking behavior. He sees his mother in a light that he has never seen her in before. And the thing is, she doesn't know that he's seeing this, and she doesn't know that he sees how she's covering it up when her husband comes home. So what we get to see here is a lot of subtext. There is a lot going on under the surface. There's a lot that we see through Amos's eyes that none of the adults recognize that he's catching. And what this does for us as the audience is it creates a level of compassion that we might not normally have if we didn't have this inside information that Amos has. And we also see how this tests Amos's love for his parents when he starts seeing them as real human beings when he's probably not really ready to. There is a point when his mom tells a very disturbing story from her childhood. It involves someone's suicide. And she doesn't go to the extent of actually divulging that specific information, but Amos can clearly pick up on the darkness that's there. And so he knows there's something more to his mother than meets the eye. And there is an interesting point where she comes in and talks to him specifically. She had gone out, she needed some space on her own, and told him to stay at home, but he follows her. And she's really just trying to get some space and get a grip. And she sees him spying on her. And afterwards, she comes back and she has this lovely, reflective talk with him about the kind of man she sees he's going to grow up to be. It's a poignant moment and very telling about how much love she has for him and what she sees in him. It is a scene to look out for. This is overall a pretty quiet movie, but there's so much going on under the surface, and I think Natalie Portman did a great job both in the screenplay as well as in the directing of capturing this. At the same time, there are some things that I felt tripped up by and that I'm not sure completely worked. I think in some ways, this is such a literary movie that it isn't always accessible, and I had to try to piece some things together at times. In the second half of the movie, it is very much about the story of his mother kind of going into some kind of decline. Whether it's depression or mental illness, it's not completely clear, and the doctors don't seem to know exactly what's going on. But after seeing what a vivacious, loving person she was before this happened, it's hard to see Amos contending with how his mother's behavior has changed. But through the narrator of the older man, he suggests that she just is bored, that she can't handle the kind of lifestyle that she is living with. While this is a narrator's story, and he lived it, that was a little bit hard to buy. Based on the past that he paints for her, it seems there's something more involved in that aspect than just what the day-to-day life was like. But because she becomes shut down and not accessible, it really has a grave impact on the interactions of everyone else in the family. But all this leads up to what he said at the beginning of the movie, which is how his mother died at 38. Other things that I struggled with are the fact that Amos did get to witness some things that we know he witnessed, but that his family doesn't know. And yet it wasn't always clear to me how what happened, based on what he witnessed, impacted him. I didn't necessarily see these things change his behavior. I saw him take them in and try and figure it out and the kind of wheel spinning in his mind, but I wasn't able to see how it translated into him doing anything differently. Even though this movie is about a child's life and these specific formative years before his mother's death, it is very much a grown-up movie. I am not sure that it is a movie that I'd want a young child to see. And as I mentioned, there are some pretty graphic, violent moments. But regardless, this is a very serious movie. And it does feel like, in general, there is some level of a dark pall over everything. And especially when we get to the wartime part, where everyone is just trying to survive. Everyone in their apartment building went into the basement just in case there might be bombs happening that night, and they cordoned off little sections so that each had a safe place to live and sleep. And those are probably some of the easier sections around the wartime to look at. Life was hard. And then what did I think about the movie overall? It is beautiful, and it is worth seeing. I would say this movie had a lot of little moments that had me have an emotional reaction, but at the end, interestingly, it was a quiet emotional response. I never had any large responses, so that's something to keep in mind. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent film, I would give this an 8. I would say that this film is probably not for everybody. It's pretty cerebral, but it is definitely worth watching, and it does show a really important historical time period. So for all those reasons, I do recommend it, and if you feel it's your cup of tea, go for it. Stay tuned for the next segment of the show when I'll be looking at the movie Pride and Prejudice.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Thank you for joining in to the second segment of the show. I am your host, Elizabeth Aaron, and in the last segment, we talked about the movie A Tale of Love and Darkness. Now, I'm going to take a look at the movie Pride and Prejudice. This movie originally came out in 2005, but I recently re-watched it, and it still holds up very well. It's a drama and romance, it's rated PG, and it's just over 2 hours long. This movie had been nominated for 4 Oscars. Best Performance by an Actress in a Leading Role for Keira Knightley, Best Achievement in Art Direction, Best Achievement in Costume Design, and Best Achievement in Music Written for Motion Pictures Original Score. It did win a BAFTA award, which is essentially like the British Oscars, and Joe Wright, the director, won the Carl Foreman Award for Most Promising Newcomer. And Joe Wright seems to like period pieces. He's also the director of Atonement, The Soloist, Anna Karenina, and The Darkest Hour. And he did win a Best Director Motion Picture Award through the Golden Globes for Atonement. And as I mentioned, this movie stars Keira Knightley. Besides being nominated for the Best Actress Oscar for Pride and Prejudice, she also was nominated for Actress in a Supporting Role for an Oscar for The Imitation Game. She has also starred in Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, Love Actually, Atonement, Colette, and Berlin, I Love You. This movie stars also Rosamund Pike, and she's also an Oscar nominee. She was nominated for Best Performance by an actress in a leading role for Gone Girl. She's known for the movies An Education, Wrath of the Titans, Jack Reacher, Beirut, and The Informer. Matthew Macfadyen is also in this movie, and he won Best Supporting Actor for a BAFTA Award in 2010 for the movie Criminal Justice. He's been in the movies Death at a Funeral, Incendiary, Frost Nixon, and Anna Karenina. And Donald Sutherland is in this movie. And if you're a Donald Sutherland fan, you may want to check back for my July 17th podcast, where I devoted an entire episode to him. He's known for the movies MASH, Eye of the Needle, Ordinary People, The Italian Job, and many more. And he received an honorary Oscar back in 2018. And lastly, I'd like to highlight Brenda Blethyn. She is also an Academy Award nominee. She was nominated for Best Actress in a Leading Role for Secrets and Lies, and also Best Actress in a Supporting Role for Little Voice. She's known for the movies Saving Grace, On a Clear Day, and The Calling. This movie is based on the novel of the same name by Jane Austen. And if you've listened to some of my past podcasts, you've probably heard the name of this movie come up in some of my top 10 lists. I've watched this movie a number of times, and it just doesn't grow old on me. Because this is a period piece, it doesn't have a dated feel to it. I also want to mention that even though this movie is told from the point of view of a woman, I think anybody who would enjoy a romantic movie, no matter what gender, would enjoy this movie. Netflix's summary of this movie says, "Sparks fly when spirited Elizabeth Bennet meets single, rich, and proud Mr. Darcy. But Mr. Darcy reluctantly finds himself falling in love with a woman beneath his class. Can each overcome their own pride and prejudice?" And I think that is an apt description. This movie takes place around 1800, I think. Keira Knightley plays Elizabeth Bennet, and she is one of 5 sisters. Their family is not all that wealthy, and as the girls get older, way back when, the way for them to find their way in the world is to marry someone who does have some money and a good reputation. And the way the game works back then is if anybody does something that makes the family have a bad name, well, then it ruins the chances of all of the sisters getting married. So that raises the stakes. Another consideration is, will you be able to marry for love? That is ideal, but sometimes it's the economic situation that takes precedent. Of the 5 sisters, Elizabeth Bennet seems to be the one who's most well-read and is wise. She's the second eldest, after Jane Bennet, played by Rosamund Pike. An excitement happens when a Mr. Bingley, who is a rich gentleman, rents a large house nearby for the summer in the country. And he is a catch. And Mrs. Bennet, played by Brenda Blethyn, her objective is to make sure all of her daughters get married off to good families, and she is beyond excited to bring her daughters out to an event where Mr. Bingley will be at. It's a country dance. The only thing is Mrs. Bennet is not very tied into how to have a good relationship with someone, and she's constantly saying things that reveal too much information, or she steps on somebody's toes, and she's also very nervous and high-strung. Meanwhile, Mr. Bennet, played by Donald Sutherland, he's even-keeled, and he's the one who has a voice of reason for this family, and he just kind of puts up with everyone. Despite the fact he loves everybody, Elizabeth seems to be his favorite, as she is the one who seems to be most grounded and have common sense. She's also very independent and speaks her mind, and he seems to have a lot of respect for that. So the entire Bennet family goes to this dance, and what we learn is that Mr. Bingley does find Jane rather attractive, and they dance quite a bit, and he has a friend. Mr. Darcy, who is at the dance with them. And when Elizabeth Bennet approaches him and asks him if he likes to dance, he says no. He seems very stone-faced, very stoic, and she is ready not to waste any time on him. So the good news is that Mr. Bingley is interested in Jane, and yet she is not of the same class as he is. And this begs the question as to whether or not it's worth the risk of marrying her. Meanwhile, what is revealed is that the Bennets live in a house that was actually inherited by a distant cousin that they've never met. And he is planning to come to check out the property, but also he's going to see if any of the Bennet daughters might make a good wife for him. He is a pastor, and he's really offensive and unattractive, and at first he shows interest in Jane, but because there seems to be some level of interest by Mr. Bingley in Jane, Brenda Bletham's character, the mother, says maybe he'd be interested in Keira Knightley's character, Elizabeth. Well, there couldn't be a worse match made for Elizabeth, but there are a number of humorous scenes where we see Elizabeth trying to get away from him and to dissuade him from proposing. And upon a hint from Mrs. Bennet and some of her daughters, they encourage Mr. Bingley to hold a big party. And it is here that we see Mr. Darcy start to show a little bit of interest in Elizabeth. He knows that she is in a class far below his, and at the same time he's enthralled with her honesty, her intelligence, her beauty. And while at the first dance he said he generally didn't dance, at this dance he proposes dancing with her. And this creates a very humorous scene because we know Elizabeth has such mixed feelings about him at this point. Eventually, though, Elizabeth finds out that Mr. Bingley is leaving the area in part because of Mr. Darcy's encouragement. This breaks Jane's heart, and it makes Elizabeth really upset. Not to mention that Elizabeth and some of the sisters end up befriending someone named Mr. Wickham, and it turns out Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy have a history, and Mr. Wickham paints a pretty dark picture of who Mr. Darcy is. And this also colors how Elizabeth sees Mr. Darcy. So when eventually Mr. Darcy finally musters up his courage to explain to Elizabeth how he truly feels, she will have none of it. She is so offended by the things that she believes he has done that she wants, like I said, to have nothing to do with him. So this is a big plot twist. And it leaves us wanting to find out, are these two going to get together? Can Elizabeth's wish to have absolutely nothing to do with him be able to turn around so that they can be together? Now, based on where we're at this point, we don't know if they should be together, because we have a similar picture of Mr. Darcy. But the second part of the movie is about how Mr. Darcy redeems himself, and what Elizabeth comes to learn about his character, and how different it is from Wickham's, and that Wickham shouldn't have been trusted in the first place. And there's also the question, would a wealthy aristocratic man come back to re-propose to somebody who has rejected him so handily? If you are not familiar with this Jane Austen story, or this version of it in particular, I highly recommend it. The acting is great. All the characters play off of each other very well. You know where they stand with each other. They get into battles with each other, and they pull surprises out. The characters are all believable. Even some of the more cartoony characters, like Mrs. Bennet and the distant cousin, they pull off making these characters human enough that you believe they could truly exist. Each character truly comes alive and brings something specific and special to the story. Some of the scenes are standout scenes to me. When Mr. Darcy approaches Elizabeth and proposes to her, they're outdoors in private, and they have an opportunity to say what they really think. And Elizabeth in particular lays into him, and there's so much passion. And he is clearly so befuddled and hurt. We know from that point forward things are going to be moving ahead differently. That really worked well. There are many other lovely moments. Some are quiet moments, but they have so much information packed in them. For example, at one point Elizabeth goes with her aunt and uncle to another area of the country. It happens to be close to where Mr. Darcy lives. It seems there is a common practice of people dropping by to some of these large homesteads where they can view all the art that's available. And often many of the masters and lords who are at these places are away anyway. So they expected Mr. Darcy would be away, and they go to visit. And this is the first time Elizabeth gets to recognize what she actually gave up by rejecting Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth's aunt and uncle don't know what transpired between her and Mr. Darcy, but the audience knows. And we get to see how enthralled she is with the idea that this could be hers. And we see Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle walk through an enormous room that is just full of statues and art. And we see her lag behind and appreciate the different pieces of art, just staring at it. And at one point she comes across a bust of Mr. Darcy, and she looks at it curiously. At this point, it seems like she must be having some kinds of second thoughts, and if not that, perhaps some level of regret. And as it turns out, after the proposal has happened, and Elizabeth has rejected Mr. Darcy, they keep accidentally crossing paths. And what transpires is an opportunity for Mr. Darcy to redeem himself. Elizabeth doesn't recognize that's what's going on, but Mr. Darcy does. And it seems for him, whether or not Elizabeth would ever reconsider, he at least gets to prove that he is not the person that she thought he was. As a result, we get to see both Elizabeth's and Mr. Darcy's characters deepen. And interestingly, even though from the beginning we know that Elizabeth rejects Mr. Darcy, on some level, we as the audience are cheering for him. Something I like about this movie that I think helps it hold up is it's not very Hollywoody. It takes place in England, it has beautiful scenery, but it's very natural. Even the dances do not seem overly costumed, overly formal. To me, it really feels like we are just stepping into the early 1800s and getting a flavor of what it really is like in those days. For example, during the dances, everyone is dressed a certain way, and yet the actors are not overly made up. The dance floor is overcrowded. The lighting is very subtle. It is quite believable. Also, this is another version of this movie. There have been previous versions made before. I haven't seen all of them, but I have seen at least one other. And this is the one that stands out in my memory. I think it's because the script is really well done. I didn't find any holes in the story. The characters are well performed and drawn out. And this version actually has quite a bit of humor in it. And I think that helps make it more memorable as well. Another scene that I really appreciate, and I've mentioned it in prior podcasts, is the scene where Donald Sutherland is questioning Elizabeth about a decision that she wants to make for her future. And it's up to him whether he wants to give permission or not. And when he recognizes how amazingly happy Elizabeth is at the idea of pursuing this future that she wants, he's just remarkable. He has such an emotional response, and it seems so genuine and from the heart. It's highly moving. He reveals how much Elizabeth is worth to him and what she means to him. This movie just genuinely takes us on a great ride. And as I've mentioned, I have watched this movie over and over, and it feels like these characters on some level have kind of become friends of mine. It's like when you go back to visit a piece of art in a museum that you've seen over and over, it becomes familiar to you and you just want to see it again. And that's how I feel about this movie. And in some ways, even though I know what is going to happen, I still get caught up in the drama of it all, and I'm still cheering the characters on as if something could change. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being most excellent, how would I rate this movie? I would give it a 10. I just love it. And there is indeed a reason why it got so many Oscar nominations. So stay tuned for the next segment of the show, when I will be talking about the movie Alone in Berlin.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Thank you for joining me for the next segment of the show. I am your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I discussed the movie Pride and Prejudice. In this segment, I'll be reviewing the movie Alone in Berlin. Alone in Berlin came out in 2016. It's rated R because there is some brief violence. It is an hour and 43 minutes long, and it is on Netflix, and this is Netflix's summary of the movie. After learning of their son's death on the battlefield, a grieving Berlin couple embark on a quietly dangerous act of resistance against Adolf Hitler. The director of this movie is Vincent Perez, and he is actually known more as an actor. He recently starred in the movie The Aeronauts, and this movie is actually the 6th movie that he has directed. The cast includes Emma Thompson, Brendan Gleeson, and Daniel Bruhl. Emma Thompson is a 2-time Oscar winner. She won an Oscar for Best Actress in a Leading Role for Howard's End, and she also won a writing Oscar back in 1996, Best Writing Screenplay based on material previously produced or published for Sense and Sensibility. She is known for such movies as Dead Again, In the Name of the Father, The Remains of the Day, Pirate Radio, and Saving Mr. Banks. Brendan Gleeson is an award winner as well. For the British Independent Film Awards, he won Best Supporting Actor for Suffragette and Best Actor for Calvary. He has starred in such movies as Braveheart, Michael Collins, and Beowulf. Daniel Bruhl has also won some acting awards. He won for the Barcelona Film Awards, Best Actor for the movie Salvador, among others. He's been in the movies Goodbye Lenin, Cargo, Ladies in Lavender, Inglourious Bastards, and Woman in Gold. So clearly from the Netflix summary, we know that this is a movie that's taking place during World War II. And something I find fascinating about this movie is there actually is quite a bit of death in it, and yet at the end, I felt hopeful. There was some sadness as well, and definitely some tragedy, but in the scheme of things, I think it left the message of hope. And I just wanted to say that up front, just because some of what I'm going to share about the story is dark. The movie starts where we see a young man who is a German soldier running through a forest. You can tell he's running for his life, and he is killed. And this is the incident that really kicks off the rest of the story. After seeing this happen, the story moves to Berlin. We see everyone celebrating, and we see a boy announcing that the headline of the newspaper is that France has fallen, and people have this sense and this pride about how Germany is poised to become a huge leader. So this all sets the big stage of what is going on in the world. And then the story moves into the specific characters. There is a mail delivery person who has a letter that is clearly an official letter that is announcing someone's death. And this mail carrier becomes integral to this story. She is acquainted with all of the people on her route, and as the mail carrier, she has some sense of everyone's news and what's going on with people. She delivers this official letter to this man and woman, a middle-aged husband and wife. The husband seems to already have a sense of what is coming, and he leaves the letter for his wife to open. And they discover the news that their only son has been killed. We get to see them struggle with their grief. How are they going to live going forward? And then we get introduced to them more intimately. We see that the husband, Otto, is a foreman at a plant that creates coffins. And the wife, Anna, she visits other women whose husbands are on the front, fighting, and she is in part responsible for helping to motivate them to do their part and to work while their husbands are doing the fighting. And as they do these things, in their grief, it becomes even clearer where they stand with regard to where the country is at. They recognize that they feel like hypocrites, and in finding a way to honor their son, they choose to do something about it. We see at one point they help protect this woman who is a Jewish woman who has been hiding out in their apartment building. And then Otto gets this idea to write out insights and tidbits of information that demonstrate how the way the country really is right now is actually moving them in the wrong direction. Now, this is sacrilege, and the way Nazi Germany was working, if you don't do what the leadership says, then your life is in danger. But Otto feels that if he can just get word out, even if people just see these words of wisdom that he's putting out there, and it plants an idea, then he's doing something good in the name of his son. There is a scene earlier on when we are first getting to know who Otto is, where he is at work and there is somebody speaking about where things are at in terms of the war. How they just took over France and they think England is going to fall soon, and as a result, they need to speed up production. And they're looking for ideas from the staff on how to do this. So Otto raises his hand and provides some ideas, but he also points out that not everyone is pulling their weight in their job. And to many of the workers, this is putting their lives in danger, and they are ready to push back. And they say to Otto, well, what have you done to help the cause? We haven't seen anything. And Otto talks about how his son got killed, and what bigger gift could he have given than his own son's life. And that certainly quieted everybody down. Point proved. Anna, his wife, is very supportive of him doing this postcard project. She's scared. She knows that it puts them in danger. But she also believes, like Otto, that this is the right thing to do. They've got to find their voices somehow to help set things straight. Everything in Germany has been turned upside down, and what was common and decent is no longer anymore. We see frequent examples of how the price of a human life has actually diminished quite a bit. So as he goes out and plants these postcards, he has to be very careful. He can't be seen. He needs to stay undercover. They need to be secretive, and hence the name of the movie, Alone in Berlin. There is a point where he says, we are completely alone, he and his wife, because they cannot tell anybody about what is going on with them, and they are taking a stand that is highly unpopular, and yet they feel is necessary. And in today's day and age, we recognize why what they did was necessary. He believed that even just the little bits that he was doing was contributing something. So as he does this, we see the story shift to a detective in the police force. He has always been excellent at his work, and he is the kind of person who always gets his man. So we see when the first postcard that was found comes to the police station, and he talks with his colleague about the postcard, and they're thinking that maybe this is just one person trying to blow off some steam. And then another card shows up. And over time, more and more cards show up. And they start pinpointing destinations of where they're finding these cards on a map. And during the movie, we start seeing some close calls of where Otto might get caught. And this certainly keeps us on our toes. Eventually, Anna begins delivering some of the postcards as well. And they at one point have to decide if they're going to continue this, and it feels like it is just the right thing to do. However, they are really smart about it, and the detective keeps getting thrown off course. And the SS men, these lead Nazis, they're getting more and more fed up with this detective because he is not able to deliver the key person who is behind all this. They see the person who's delivering these postcards as not only going against the Führer, Adolf Hitler, but he's also creating some cracks in the belief system of this new culture that is coming about as a result of Hitler. It is indeed a threat, and the longer the postcards keep coming, the greater the threat is. We start to see the detective, who is played by Daniel Bruhl, start losing it, and the military officers start holding him accountable for not being able to find this person. He thought he had an in with these leaders, that he was respected by them, and this changes when he takes too long to find the person who's responsible for the postcards. And the movie makes this interesting shift, because on one hand, we are rooting for Otto, who, by the way, is played by Brendan Gleeson, and for Anna, who is played by Emma Thompson. We know they're the good guys, and we want them to win. But we also see Daniel Bruhl and how he is a good guy too. He is a detective who wants to do right by what his leaders want, and we see him suffering as a result. So our loyalties are kind of going all over the place. We can sympathize with each of them and each of their plights. I don't want to go into how this ends. I don't want to spoil it. And yet what I will leave you with is, in general, things don't go well in Nazi Germany. And suffice it to say, there is a scene towards the end where we do see Anna and Otto surrounded by a group of people who will have some say about what they've been doing. And they're all saying Heil Hitler, and they're the only ones who are not. and by showing how they are outnumbered, really demonstrates how dire the situation has become. So about the movie in general, the quality of this movie is great. The picture is great to watch, and the acting is fabulous. Now, some of the acting takes place just within small apartments, especially when it comes to Anna and Otto. They have to hide and stay safe. And it reminded me a lot of what we're going through right now during this pandemic and needing to be sheltering in place. Seeing this movie now, under these current circumstances that we're in, really helped me relate to it a lot more. And as a result, the scenes that take place are very theatrical within these small spaces. And these actors just do such a great job. They are following their instincts. They have a lot of feelings. They're showing up specifically as these characters. When you see good acting like this, you just don't want it to stop. And that's definitely the sense that I had with this. And while I think it is particularly true of the scenes with Anna and Otto, it's pretty true for just about every scene. These actors are just rocking it. They're all very believable. They made the story come alive. In the scheme of things, this story is a small story. It's about a man who, out of rebellion, is writing postcards and dropping them off places. It doesn't seem like a big deal. But the story carries the gravity of what this means and what it achieves. And by the way, my understanding is this is a story that is based on true life. And it is fascinating to see how these actors pull off being these people who are in this for their lives, who are willing to risk so much to do the right thing. And by the way, they are writing these postcards during the Nazi regime between 1940 and 1943, just to place it in the specific years. This movie is also important just because it is about finding your voice and having it no matter what the circumstances are. It's something that no one can take away, and it's what we're experiencing today with all the protests that are happening. So even though this is a period piece, it is very relevant for a lot of what we're experiencing today. In terms of the story, this script is solid. Each action easily led to what was going to be happening next, and it led me along a journey that I wanted to stay in touch with. I kept wanting to know what was going to happen next, and who was going to come out on top. And it being Nazi Germany, would anybody come out on top? Everything felt pretty natural and flowed quite well. If there was anything that was unclear to me, it was at the very beginning when Otto and Anna get the letter that their son has been killed. There's a point where when Otto leaves the letter for his wife to open, I was questioning what that was about. And then he also asked her if this was about the boy. And the way she responded, it sounded very much like she was blaming her husband to some degree about what had happened. And I wasn't even sure at first if they were husband and wife. I wasn't feeling a lot of chemistry. Or if the son was actually Anna's, or was it both of theirs? Did she remarry at a later date or not? So if you do watch it, just to fill you in, they are indeed married, and this is the son of both of them. And in fact, it is their only son. I feel like it can be tough with these period pieces, which so many of which are around a war. But these stories show us some history, and they can teach us how indeed we are so fortunate with what we have now, and that we should fight to keep it. I love when a movie is pulled together so well that you are just caught up in the story, and you don't have to pay attention so much to the different elements. You just want to be whisked away into this other world and identify with what is going on. In this case, this is not an easy movie. It has some very real and very tender moments. It also has some disturbing and shocking moments, as is probably not a surprise when we're talking about World War II and Adolf Hitler. So many World War II stories to me have focused on the concentration camps, and I like that this movie is focused on just two ordinary people who are living in Berlin at the time of the war, and how they themselves found an opportunity to make some kind of difference. I expect that there are actually quite a few of these stories. I personally just haven't seen a lot of them made into movies, especially something that is so small and subtle as this, but could make such a big difference. In this movie, something that mattered to Otto so much was to see what people's responses were to his postcards. It really frustrated him that he was going to the trouble of making these cards and not being sure if he touched anyone. A lot of the cards were turned in to the detectives, and it seemed even for some time he didn't even know that. He didn't know where the cards were going. But it was also this desire to see how people were responding that got him a bit into trouble. It made him take more risks because he wanted to see what people's responses were. But this is this whole other element that keeps us on edge. And by planting that seed, I know I personally also wanted to see how people were responding to what he was doing. Was it worth going to the trouble of taking this risk if people weren't going to respond? In the end, we do learn that there's a number of cards that never did get turned in. And so that provides a certain glimpse of hope that maybe these cards didn't get turned in because people wanted to keep them and they believed in what was being stated, even if it was against the Nazi regime. So, a difficult movie? Yes. A worthwhile movie? Definitely. I think this is the kind of movie that can create a lot of discussion and reflection afterwards. This is definitely not a feel-good date night movie, but it is definitely a quality movie and a good story. So if that's what you're looking for, you'll get that here. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent movie, I would give this an 8. I'm not sure why exactly I wouldn't give it a 9 or 10. 8 just feels right. So take that into consideration, and if you watch it, I hope that you get a lot out of it, as much as I did. Stay tuned for the final segment of the show, when I'll be reviewing the movie The Ottoman Lieutenant.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Thank you for joining me for the final segment of the show. This is your host, Elizabeth Aaron, and in the last segment, I talked about the movie Alone in Berlin, and in this segment, I'm going to be talking about a movie called The Ottoman Lieutenant. This is a new movie on Netflix, although the movie itself came out originally in 2017. It's an hour and 50 minutes long. It's rated R because there is some war violence. It's considered a period piece, a drama, and a war story. And the summary on Netflix says, a spirited nurse in a foreign land falls in a dangerous love triangle as the world teeters on the brink of chaos. This movie was directed by Joseph Rubin. He is known for the movies Dreamscape, Sleeping with the Enemy, and The Stepfather. And he won the Grand Prix Award for the movie True Believer at the Cognac Festival du Film Policier. And in that same festival a year earlier, he won the Critics Award for the movie The Stepfather. This movie stars Ben Kingsley, Josh Hartnett, Hera Hilmar, and Michiel Huisman. Ben Kingsley plays the role of Dr. Woodruff in this movie. He has had many nominations and award wins, including Best Actor in a Leading Role for the movie Gandhi. He's been in the movies Schindler's List, Tuck Everlasting, The Whackness, and Hugo, among many others. Josh Hartnett plays the role of Jude in this movie, and back in 2006, he won the Best Actor Award at the Milano International Film Festival Awards for the movie Lucky Number 11. He's been in the movies Pearl Harbor, Black Hawk Down, Wicker Park, and Wild Horses. Hera Hilmar is an Icelandic actress. In 2017, she won Actress of the Year Award at the Edda Awards in Iceland. Much of her work has been in Iceland, but out of Iceland she did star in the movie Anna Karenina, and she's known for starring in the television series Da Vinci's Demons. She plays the protagonist in this movie, Lily, and Michiel Huisman, who plays Ismael in this movie, is known for being in the TV series Game of Thrones and he shared a Cine Euphoria Award with the cast for that TV series, and he had won the Favorite Actor Award in 2005 at the Netherlands Film Festival. He is also known for the movies World War Z, Irreplaceable You, and the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. This movie is ultimately Lily's story. It starts back in 1914, and it's right at the cusp of World War I. The movie starts with what appears to be a flashback. However, I'll say from the very start, it doesn't come full circle. So it's a little confusing as to whether it really is a flashback. In any case, something we learn from the very start is that she is a nurse. She is working in Philadelphia at a hospital. And an incident happens right at the start that has her question whether or not the values held at the hospital where she works are her own. A black man brings in another black man who has been injured. He has a puncture wound in his neck, and if he doesn't get help right away, he's going to bleed out. Now Lily has no qualms about wanting to help him, yet everyone around her sees the color of his skin and says he should not be coming there for help. Even a doctor comes in and says that she's doing the wrong thing. She is fed up by this. She values all life, and clearly she would prefer to work in a place that had that same value. Immediately following this incident, she heads to a talk given by, as it turns out, the character played by Josh Hartnett. It is Dr. Jude Gresham. He talks about the work he's doing at a mission hospital that is based in eastern Anatolia. He gives a slideshow showing pictures of the people, and you can see that Lily is enthralled. When Lily showed up at this talk, she sat down next to her mother. And it turns out that her parents seem rather wealthy, and following this talk, there is a fundraising party at their rather lush home. We see Jude talking to her parents, and she walks over and overhears how he talks about the miracles of modern medicine, and she challenges him by saying, well, for sure, modern medicine is miraculous, but you need to be able to change the doctor's minds. So he probes a little bit and finds out about the incident that happened to her earlier that day. And he assures her that at the mission hospital, they would never turn anybody away. Lily appears to be liking what she's hearing, and she invites Dr. Gresham, Jude, to come out to the garage, and she wants to show him something. It's a truck that had belonged to her deceased brother, and she wants to donate it to the mission. He appreciates her generosity, but explains that in eastern Anatolia, which is in Turkey, it's very rough, very rural, and there's not really a way to get the truck there. And she is rather bullheaded and says that she will find a way. Then she walks Jude over to his ride, and they shake hands, and they talk about how they hope they see each other again sometime. She watches after him as the car pulls away, and he turns around and looks out the back window, and you can see that there is some chemistry there, and there's some level of interest. But there's not a lot to pursue because at this point she is in Philadelphia, and he is in eastern Anatolia. We then see her have a conversation with her parents about the fact that she is going to deliver this truck to Turkey. Her parents put their foot down. They tell her essentially that she's crazy, that she has to do what most 23-year-olds like her do, which is to get married and start a family, and that it's just too dangerous for her to do this. She basically says it's a done deal. She's doing it. Next thing we know, she is on a ship, and it is about to land in Istanbul. As soon as she gets off the boat, she runs into Michael Huisman's character, Ismail. She was just about to be taken advantage of by a local when he notices and speaks English and points out to her that she's doing a tourist thing and she's about to be ripped off. She's grateful to him for pointing this out and says that she just wanted to see one of the mosques and asks him to point her in the right direction, and he says he'll take her there himself. At first she's not sure if she can trust him, but she follows him, and they do indeed land at the mosque. And after a group of men enter the mosque to signal that they should no longer be there, they do a quick introduction, and he says that he is Lieutenant Ismail Veli of the Ottoman Imperial Army. Well, it is very convenient that she happened to meet him, because when she goes back to the boat to get the truck unloaded along with a bunch of medical supplies that she's pulled together, the man who was hired to transport her said it's no longer safe for this to happen. A war is imminent, and he cannot put himself or any of his workers at risk. She explains that she did not come that far just to turn around. So were there any other options? He suggests that she get a military escort, and seeing as she just met this lieutenant and it's the only person she knows and the only military person she knows there, she somehow gets word out that she would like him to be the escort. And for political reasons, he ultimately does it. But he's not happy about it, and he lets her know that. And they start actually now getting off on the wrong foot. They have some adventures together as they first take a train and then caravan to the mission hospital. When they arrive, Jude sees her instantly and is so excited to see her and asks her how she got there. Up until this point, in terms of the love story, it seems like Jude is the winner. Ismail seems a little impatient with the fact that Lily knows so little about the culture and about the religions, and he was frustrated in the first place that he had to bring her on this trip. Although there were some incidents throughout the journey that they did have to get a little bit too close for comfort. But the chemistry didn't seem to be there. And the fact is, she already had a connection with Jude from before, and there was something magical about seeing a familiar face, especially so far away from where they originally met. So Jude shows her around the hospital, and she introduces her to Dr. Woodruff, played by Ben Kingsley. Like Lily's parents, he feels she should not be there. But she wants to stay and be a nurse there. And after proving her skills, she stays. But Dr. Woodruff continues to be pretty ornery, and it's really not until at one point she sees his vulnerability and really is compassionate and takes care of him that he starts shifting his opinion about her. He himself had experienced the tragic loss of the love of his life, and he understands what it's like to have the passion of medicine. He is pretty much a pessimist, but he and Lily do seem to have a connection around people who mean something deeply to you. And in this way, they become kind of friends and allies. And going forward, we start to see that there is some jealousy building between Ismail and Jude. And more of the war starts coming into play. This includes the number of patients that they see and the kinds of things that need to be treated, as well as issues of safety. And in Lily's case, especially being a single young white American woman. She continually feels she has to prove that she can handle it and that she's tough. And she is. She does handle it. But there are also some lessons along the way that are pretty unexpected for her. And the journey is ultimately about how she finds her purpose working in this missionary hospital. Throughout this movie, we see themes of love, religious differences, cultural differences, and we get a glimpse of war and peace. And that is a lot of ground to cover, and I think this movie bit off more than it could chew. It seems like it's trying to be an epic movie, and in some ways it has the feel of that. In terms of quality, I kept thinking of Dr. Zhivago. Something about the quality of the picture had a sort of older-fashioned feel, which was kind of nice considering this movie was set back in the early 1900s. But the fact is, it didn't feel like the script went deep enough with the characters in order to pull that epic feeling off. And I found a good number of holes in the script. There are these moments where the characters meet up, and it's just a little too coincidental. There is a point where when the person who had to do the delivery of the truck said to her that the war was imminent and they didn't want to go, well, it seems that for some time we hear the war is imminent, and yet we're led to believe that it was going to happen in just a few days. We get to a point where Lily is actually starting to speak the local language, and that's the kind of thing that takes some time. So there really is this sense that a good passage of time has already taken place, and the war has yet to begin. There is also an incident that happens during the journey with Ismail, and this is on their way to the mission hospital. I don't want to give it away, but the fact is, at some point, they don't seem to have food, water, money, no papers like passport or identification, and this doesn't seem to be a concern. But to be realistic, it seems it should have at least been mentioned, or some kind of struggle around this should have been shown. Instead, it just seemed the movie was caught up in the romance of the adventure, and it left out these realistic details. And in terms of costumes, especially for the men, or at least how they looked, it seemed like their hairstyles were much more modern day than something that would belong way back in the early 1900s. There is also a point where the truck she brought has a flat tire, and we never see that get resolved. And while that seems small, they're so in the middle of nowhere. To be able to get a tire, this seems like it's pretty much the only vehicle around, that must have been quite a feat. So there's a sense that there's something more important about the movie, that it doesn't have to deal with these details. But to me, it seems like skipping these details are actually what detracts from the movie. And the whole love aspect of this movie fell short for me. I am a real sucker for a good love story. I tend to get caught up in the excitement of it and the feelings. Well, in this case, it was pretty confusing about where anyone's loyalties actually lied. Except probably for Josh Hartnett's character, Jude. It seemed pretty clear from the start that he is interested in Lily, and that never changes. But there is a point where he gets pretty jealous and ends up starting a fist fight with Ismail. So 1, this is pretty stereotypical. 2, he's a doctor, and Ismail is a trained soldier. I just think completely buy that this fight was in the cards. I think it would have been much more powerful if it just showed the two men witnessing each other with Lily, and see them wrestle with the feelings that they have about it. There's something about playing out that subtext that deepens how we see the characters and the richness in who they actually are. And throughout, it did seem at first like Lily was really into Jude, and at one point she starts showing some signs of liking Ismail. Yet there didn't seem to be any particular incident that happened to spur this on. And while I think in these three-way love stories there generally is confusion, and that's normal, where this love story landed, there didn't seem to be any impetus for it. It just didn't make any sense to me. Not that it couldn't have been realistic, just the things that needed to be in place to make what happened realistic weren't there. Not to mention, with some of the scenes that were meant to be probably among the most romantic, seemed pretty unnatural to me. The acting in this movie felt hit or miss to me. My favorite in terms of acting in this movie was Ben Kingsley, Dr. Woodruff. He was consistent. I felt like he had a history that I believed. He was interesting. He was unpredictable. And there was an intensity about him that he'd carried that made me look forward to every little scene that he was in. He did play more of a supporting role, but he did a great job. I also liked Josh Hartnett's character, Jude, quite a bit. He had some really great lines that made you think quite a bit. He was clearly invested in what he did and what he believed in, and he had some depth. In terms of Hera Hilmar, I did find her to be a strong-minded, fearless, adventurous type, and she carried that pretty well consistently throughout the movie. That said, she was also the narrator of the story, and I found her to be pretty flat, and even her character within the movie seemed pretty flat. And the parts where she would be the most emotional probably were within the love story. And it may have been because the love story was diluted because there were two men and there was this choice that kind of had to be made that made it harder to believe that she would have as strong feelings as she came across showing in the movie than she actually had. I think this movie probably would have been better off if there had only been one love interest. But within that love interest, it would take some time for there to be an admission of that true love. And Mikael Wiesmann's character, Ismail, there was something magnetizing about him, and he was great to watch. But by the time he got to show more of what his feelings were for Lily, it came more as a surprise than the sense of him actually having more feelings for her. In general, the actors themselves played off each other well. I think ultimately it was well cast. And I think the actors actually probably raised the script level because of the quality of their work. But it didn't feel to me like it was enough to really hold this piece together in a way that it achieved what it was setting out to. So there's a lot that I did like about this movie. I liked being whisked off in this adventure. I genuinely liked the characters. In terms of the story and what it was trying to do historically, I don't think it completely met the mark. Some scenes were stronger than others. It was inconsistent. It was beautiful to watch. There was some really nice cinematography here. Although I will say that one teacher I had learned from had said that if one of the main things you say about a movie is that the cinematography was great, then the movie probably didn't achieve what it wanted to, because you should be more caught up in the story than in cinematography. And I've definitely found that to be true. So I did find this entertaining, but there were some things that didn't work. And so going into this movie, I think it's just good to know that it is not going to necessarily be the epic film that it looks like it is. I was disappointed that we didn't come full circle back to the beginning where she's recounting the story, although she does recount some things at the end. And while she writes a letter to her parents at some point, there seems to be no contact with them at all. And while it's clear that she felt that they didn't understand her in many ways, they were her only family, and she's their only daughter. They'd already lost their son to death. And here she's being a nurse who's supposed to be compassionate. And I just found it hard to believe that there wouldn't have been some effort to make more contact with the only family that she has. And as she makes a choice in love, granted she's very young, but she handles it pretty poorly, I think. And that's okay, that may be a valid part of the movie, but it just raised some questions for me. So this movie, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most excellent movie, I'd give it a 6. I think it would be fun to watch. It is a good escape. At the same time, it is not at all perfect. So just keep that in mind, and then you won't be disappointed. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the movies A Tale of Love and Darkness, Pride and Prejudice, Alone in Berlin, and The Ottoman Lieutenant. Here's to these period films offering you some inspiration. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.